A title of this presentation this morning I found very intriguing. And before I introduce it, it's a delight to actually hear from Jill Kimberly Hartwell Geoffrion. Now that's a mouthful, and she's a Reverend Doctor to boot. I've read several of her books and am familiar with her, but I've never had a chance to meet her face to face, although it is virtual. So Jill, this is a delight for me to have this opportunity this morning. And I'm just going to read the information that we put on the website because it's just really brilliant. And then I'll read the sort of the summary of the presentation because I think that'll help us set some context because that's in the title of your presentation, and then give you a little bit of information about Jill's background for those of you who are not familiar with Jill, which I'm sure many of us are, but there may be some here who are not. Would you like to experience the beauty of the beloved Chartres Labyrinth more fully? The apparent simplicity of this 11th Circuit labyrinth that graces the floor of the Chartres Cathedral in France is rivaled only by its unseen complexity. This visual exploration will first situate the medieval Chartres labyrinth in relationship to the historic development of labyrinth patterns. Then images will unveil how its placement within the Chartres Cathedral's architecture include a detailed conversation between the many disciplines taught and practiced in the medieval School of Chartres, including sacred geometry, astronomy, theology, music, and liturgy. The pattern's layered meanings will come to life through examination of the stained glass that surrounds the labyrinth and the symbolic shapes within the carefully designed labyrinth. The goals of this presentation include inspiring wonder, offering new perspectives, identifying topics for future research, and encouraging consideration of local context as a vital part of labyrinth construction. A few words about Jill's background. She's published 7 books, as well as numerous scholarly and popular articles on the labyrinth. Her most recent book, Visions of Mary, Art, Devotion, and Beauty at Chartres Cathedral, is the fruit of many years of exploration and guiding in the cathedral. She's a professional photographer, and Jill's visual work points to the unique character and inspiration of labyrinth prayer, of the Chartres Cathedral and sacred sites around the world. In her global ministry, Jill installs large-scale Chartres-style labyrinths, often working in places of violence and acute suffering. Jill is a longtime member of TLS, having served as a regional rep, energy keeper, presenter at gatherings, contributor to TLS publications, and not least of which is an enthusiastic ambassador for the worldwide labyrinth locator. Wow. An impressive list of credentials, Jill. Thank you for coming to share with us. One technical question from my end as your moderator. Would you like me to give you a heads up when we're getting close to the question and answer time?
Absolutely, Frank, please.
Okay, so without any further ado, I'm going to invite Jill to come and speak with us. Please do put your questions in the chat, and we'll welcome Jill.
One second here. I'm just trying to, well, actually, before I share my screen, let me just say hello to everyone. I can't wait till we can all get back together again. Let me see if I can fix that. I'm greeting you this morning. Well, this morning for you, and this afternoon, this evening for me here in Chartres, and I'm delighted to be at the gathering, even from such a faraway distance. So let me share my screen and let's get going. Okay, can you see my screen now? Frank, can you give me some feedback?
Yes, Jill, we're looking at your entire desktop screen.
Oh, not good.
So I don't know if you prefer to.
Let me go back. Let me go back. That should not have happened. It's always good to have something go wrong at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Here we go. We're done with that. How does that look?
Perfect. Perfect.
Excellent. Well, again, I'm just greeting you from the city of Chartres on this beautiful afternoon here.
Jill?
We've got some.
Jill,
Yes.
one more note. Can you move your toolbar down below your presentation?
What a great idea.
Thank you.
Okay. Is it gone now, or can you see it at all?
Perfect.
Okay, thanks. I hope to share with you this afternoon, today, whatever time it is where you are, the wonderful energy of the sacred site as we journey together in the next hour. Many of us are familiar with the 11th circuit pattern of the Chartres Labyrinth. My goal, as you heard earlier, is to show the ways in which the cathedral context helps to deepen our appreciation and use of it. For all of us who install labyrinths, and if that doesn't include you, it can, because if I can install a labyrinth, absolutely anyone can. I also hope that I will share, what I share will inspire us to take even more seriously the potential of the sites where we build labyrinths so their gifts can flourish fully. I will be taking us around many twists and turns and hope that as we share this pathway of discovery, your curiosity will be sparked so that no matter what your interest, you will find ways to perceive how to take the next steps on the journey. Today, we want to think like medieval folks, seeking the many layers of interpretation of this labyrinth and its context, and welcoming them all. The labyrinth, although installed in specific locations like Chartres, with specific intentions, is a universal symbol that calls for multiple avenues of understanding. I'm an artist, a researcher, theologian, and basically just a general labyrinth fanatic. These and my many other identities clearly influence but do not limit my experience of the Chartres Labyrinth. I hope through the example of my approach to situating this labyrinth in its original context, I will spark many ideas for avenues of exploration that match with your interests so that we can continue to learn more together and enrich all of our understanding of this beloved labyrinth. I hope you will approach this presentation like a labyrinth walk in Chartres, your labyrinth walk. As we meander along the path, notice what you notice. Listen for what calls you. Seek to understand what you're thinking and feeling metaphorically. If something isn't aligning with where you are today, remember, we'll move around a turn and be onto something else before too long. So join me now as we move towards Chartres, as millions of others have done before. The thrill of seeing the cathedral rise up before us never gets old. Now, please join me as we prepare to enter the cathedral, using a ritual I learned at a TLS gathering 23 years ago. We often use it in Chartres. As we bow our heads, we remember that the first step on the path is humility. The second step, letting go, is symbolized by holding two fists out. I like to think of something I need to let go of so that I can be present, and letting it go. The third step, receiving, is honored by turning our palms up in a gesture of openness. For the fourth step, both hands are placed over the heart, and together we ask, may the path lead us home. Bienvenue and welcome to the Chartres Cathedral. As we look down the nave, we see two people, and although it might not be readily apparent, they're standing in the middle of the labyrinth. Since it's not a Friday, the only day that the cathedral takes the chairs off, we can't see the whole labyrinth in its uncovered glory, but let's go join them anyway. What is this pattern's historical context? When I first came to Chartres in 1978 as an art history student, we didn't even see the labyrinth under all the chairs. When I came back in the mid-1990s, I imagined that somehow the builders of the cathedral had thought this wonder up by themselves. Of course, there's a much more nuanced and historical reality than that. What I have discovered is that there is a long history of labyrinth development that surely influenced the choices made about the pattern laid on the floor of Chartres. As Richard Shelton said in his helpful article in Cardroia entitled The Road to Chartres, Roman mosaic labyrinths in particular had a great influence on the European medieval labyrinths. Although clearly different than the later designs, these Roman labyrinths had 4 quadrants, were sometimes displayed on the floor, represent cities with their protective battlements around the outside, and often had images of Theseus and the Minotaur in their centers. Medieval Christian manuscripts give us clues in understanding the form of the labyrinth at Chartres too. They were used to illustrate many different concepts. And just as their interpretations of the meaning developed, so did their form. Here, we see one of the first 11th Circuit labyrinths. Monks experimented with the 11th Circuit form. And over time, the ways in which labyrinths were understood began to be represented by what was placed in the center. Here, a threatening minotaur or devil-like figure. Each manuscript labyrinth has its own character, much like the floor labyrinths we will see later. In the 11th century, Theseus began to appear near the labyrinth or in it in some of the manuscripts. This labyrinth is interesting because of the extensions that surround it. We will find extensions at the Labyrinth of Chartres in the next century too. As time passed, we found both Theseus and the Minotaur depicted in some of the manuscript labyrinths in the center. And then in the 12th century, small labyrinths began to be installed in churches in Italy. Many of them used 11th Circuit patterns identical to the one later installed in a much larger format in Chartres. Then in the late 12th or early 13th century, walkable labyrinths began being installed in the churches in France. Most, as you can see, had features that were not identical to the others. Now with joy, we arrive at Chartres. Having seen the long history of labyrinths that led us here, we need to turn our attention to the sacred site on which the Chartres Cathedral was built. The cathedral, visible from miles around, sits on a high promontory in Beauce, the region in which Chartres is its capital. It's a rich agricultural plain. Beauce lies atop of the largest, or the second largest groundwater table or aquifer in France. The aquifer under Chartres has one of the most significant depths, 164 feet or 50 meters below the ground. The well in the crypt at Chartres extends all the way down to the water table, meeting it 120 feet below the cathedral. This is but one of the wells at the Chartres Cathedral. Water has been an abundant resource here. As evidenced by the dolmens scattered around the area, it's obvious that people have used this region for their sacred activities for millennia. During Gallo-Roman period, sanctuaries to the Roman gods were built in Chartres. And Caesar mentioned that the Druids also used this area to hold their annual meetings. And so it's no surprise that when Christians came to the area, they chose to build their sanctuary on the sacred promontory. As their churches were destroyed by war and fire, they rebuilt on successively larger footprints. The cathedral is oriented to the northeast, and so the labyrinth too has the same northeastern orientation. We're not sure of the reasons for this, but the ancients were very careful about how they oriented their sacred sites. So we can assume that this orientation is significant for this particular building. As an aside, when I started building labyrinths, I wanted to orient them to the east to be like the Chartres labyrinth. And I discovered that fact checking is always helpful. The Chartres Cathedral is considered a Bible in stone and glass. It's basically an encyclopedia of all knowledge that was known in the medieval times. Really, there's something for everyone in Chartres. I've given tours on birds to people who just loved birds, and one of the most meaningful visits I ever gave was spent praying with the suicide images in the cathedral when a man whose wife had recently taken her life came to seek healing. The Chartres Cathedral can be thought of as a complex universe. As the cathedral rose, symbols were used to express doctrine and meaning. Those who come are invited to enter the mystery and to look for symbolic significance everywhere. The use of flying buttresses on the outside and pointed arches inside allowed the builders of the current Gothic cathedral in Chartres, which was built basically from 1194 until 1220, to experiment with higher elevations while letting in more light. As you can see and feel, Gothic architecture lifts and illuminates, something that the labyrinth on the floor might also be said to do in its own way. When the church was consecrated in 1260, it was dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. At Chartres, the beauty and fecundity of life is celebrated. For some unknown and certainly ancient reason, no one is buried here. Part of the emphasis on life at Chartres stems from the fact that the main cathedral relic, which would have attracted many pilgrims and actually still does, is a piece of cloth said to be worn by Mary during either the Annunciation or the birth of Jesus, or possibly both. It was donated to the cathedral in 876 by Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, who had received it as a gift from the Byzantine Empress Irene. It is known as the tunic of the Virgin or the veil of Mary. The tender love of the mother is everywhere at Chartres. Pilgrimage was one of the primary purposes of the cathedral. Besides welcoming local pilgrims who were coming to pray for Mary's help, it was on the third most important medieval pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. This stained glass window of St. James, with all the scallop shells representing the Camino pilgrimage, you can see them surrounding him, is located directly above the labyrinth in the south clerestory. Images of those who came on local and distant pilgrimages to pray to Christ, to Mary, and to the saints for help can be found throughout the cathedral. So in this pilgrimage cathedral dedicated to Mary, we have to ask, why was the labyrinth embedded in the floor? Unfortunately, we have no original documentation that can help us. But by examining the cathedral itself, it is clear that on the most basic level, architecturally, it was one of the keys to the construction of the building. Although there is not complete agreement about the date when the labyrinth was installed, almost every serious scholar agrees it was in the floor by 1220. And since the labyrinth certainly served more than one purpose, it may be that before the stone labyrinth, similar labyrinth drawings or other, sometimes in the medieval period, they would put sand on the floor and draw in the sand, may have been used in the construction of the building. It was a common medieval practice to use one architectural element to find the correct dimension for others. And although we don't know why, we can see that the current labyrinth was placed in a very significant historical position on the very threshold of the previous cathedral built by Fulbert that had burnt down. Robert Joly, whose work on the cathedral outlines all the historical documents available about the labyrinth historically, said this: "One must ask if the placement of the entrance of the labyrinth, which touches the doorway of the previous cathedral, marks at least symbolically a type of passage." The spot is also marked by a cross on the ceiling vault. The cross was originally painted by 1300, and at least, and it was rediscovered at the most recent restoration and repainted. Let me go back to that. You can see the cross here. It's a four-armed cross, and it's high on the vault, right below the entrance to the old cathedral and the labyrinth. There are other ways to see the significance of the labyrinth's placement in the cathedral. John James, the Australian architect who had studied the building more closely than anyone else, shows the labyrinth here as one of the 4 points that are most significant in what he calls the creation schema behind the Chartres labyrinth. In his massive work, Chartres, the Builders, James explains how the placement of the labyrinth and the main altar were used in determining the layout of the whole cathedral. This diagram shows the same thing, that the labyrinth was an important key in the overall floor plan. So no matter what the labyrinth was used for later, we know that first it served as a vital architectural purpose. Using that medieval belief that meaning is layered, we should and can look for other ways to understand the labyrinth's placement in the cathedral. It may be surprising to us, but medieval historians tell us the cathedral was called Mary's home, Mary's palace, Mary's throne room, and even Mary's bedroom. Mary's private apartments were in the east, in the apse. Her throne room was in the choir, where only the clergy were allowed. And her reception room, her hall for visitors for the laity, was in the nave. In Christian churches, the nave was considered the area of the church where the laity gathered and worshiped. The root of the word nave is the Latin word for ship. Here, we are looking up from the center of the labyrinth. The vaulting in the nave recalls the hull of an ark and protection from terrors of the deep. At Chartres, the nave tilts to the west wall. Pilgrims literally walk up to the altar, just as in the biblical text, pilgrims walked up to Jerusalem. During organized pilgrimages, which happened 4 times a year on Mary's feast day, hundreds of pilgrims would sleep in the nave, including on the labyrinth, which is one of my dreams. Afterwards, the floor needed to be cleaned, and so there was a whole system put in place that allowed that to happen, bringing in water from outside and then washing across the labyrinth and down out the west wall, out the west doors, I guess I should say. While modern day labyrinth walkers can look right into the choir, where we see the massive statue of the Assumption of Mary beyond the cross. In the Middle Ages, there was a rood screen that completely blocked the choir area of the priests from the nave where the laity worshiped. Medieval labyrinths were placed in the west portion of the church, closest to, I guess, farthest, how do I want to say that? The west representing the setting sun, transitioning from the darkness, moving in towards the light in the east. And they were often located in the 3rd and 4th bays. Here's the 3rd bay of the nave. Here's the 4th bay, 5th bay, 6th bay. The number 3, as represented by the 3rd bay, represented spirit or divinity. And the number 4, 4th bay being here, represented matter. Thus, the meeting of the two meant that the labyrinth symbolically combined heaven and earth. At the dedication of the cathedral in 1260, some of the pillars were blessed and named for the apostles, and statues were attached to them, as we see here in this engraving. Thomas on the north and Simon on the south were the pillars that line up exactly with the middle of the labyrinth. Unfortunately, they were removed in 1793 during the French Revolution. The labyrinth was a part of a busy house of worship and exchange. I say exchange because here in the aisles, lots of things were sold and bought, and also the workmen carried on their trades as was needed. As early as 1300, altars were built abutting to the pillars of the nave. So masses were celebrated around the labyrinth on a regular and most likely daily basis until 1601, when they were removed. If we had time, I could explain in detail how some of the altars were used. For instance, there's an altar on the north dedicated to Mary Magdalene, and it was related also to the stained glass around the labyrinth that depicted her. As we continue to seek to understand the labyrinth in the Chartres Cathedral, we need to consider how it may have aligned with and illustrated some of what was being taught at the prestigious School of Chartres, which was functioning as a cathedral at the cathedral before and as the cathedral was being rebuilt after the fire in 1194. The School of Chartres was a cathedral school run and supported by the local bishop. The focus was on schooling clergy whose studies took between 9 and 12 years. One of the famous teachers of the School of Chartres was Fulbert. He was affectionately called the Venerable Socrates of the School of Chartres. Besides being bishop from 1005 to 1028, he taught a variety of subjects, including arithmetic, the astrolabe, which was a model of the universe, astronomy, dialectics, geometry, grammar, medicine, music, rhetoric, sociology, and theology. There were 3 key concepts of the teaching at the School of Chartres. The first was integument. There exists many layers to things, words and experiences, and these layers must be pulled back to reveal hidden meaning. Coverings or envelopes are placed over truth. They contain within them and beneath them divine meaning. The second key concept was exemplarism. Divine ideas exist in the world of perfection or the world of ideas, and these in turn exist in the things of this world as an image of the original. And the final key concept at the school was that there was a vivifying force in all things, a force which moves the heavens and a fountain from which all human souls are formed. The teaching of the School of Chartres were physically incorporated or even embedded into the building as it was constructed and decorated. Here on the west wall of the cathedral, which was completed between 1145 and 1155, we see the 7 liberal arts that were taught at the School of Chartres, sculpted as women and paired with the male philosophers that represented their disciplines. If we look to the stained glass to see an illustration of key teachings, the south lancet windows under the rose provide a perfect example. Students were taught both humility and a deep respect for spiritual and intellectual ancestors on whose shoulders they stood. The labyrinth is the largest decorative element in the cathedral, even larger than the rose windows. And so it seems impossible to imagine that the labyrinth, which was such a prominent feature of the cathedral, wasn't also related to what was being taught at the School of Chartres. The disciplines of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music are the most likely, but certainly not the only candidates. We will never fully understand the labyrinth at Chartres if we don't consider its relationship to the many liturgies that were performed there. After all, one of the main functions of the church was to connect people with the divine through ritual action. Chartres Cathedral was well known in the Middle Ages as a place of liturgical processions. Processions to specific windows on feast days of the saint represented in them, as well as longer processions, such as the one simulating Holy Week in Jerusalem that involved leaving the cathedral and visiting various stations throughout the surrounding countryside, took place throughout the liturgical year and were repeated annually. Once labyrinths were placed on the floor of cathedrals, they could be used as performative spaces where the mysteries of the faith could be enacted through liturgical dramas, processions, and yes, even dances. Descriptions of clergy dancing on and around the labyrinth as they celebrated Christ's resurrection on Easter are recorded in both Amiens and Reims. Craig Wright, professor of history and music at Yale, wrote of the dramatic purposes of these dances that took place on Easter evening. He describes in detail how the clergy's movement around and on the labyrinth mirrored the harrowing of hell when Christ, having overcome the devil and death, brought the captives out of hell. Medieval theologians describe this as the Christianized version of the Greek myth of Theseus' victory over the Minotaur. There were documented Easter dances on the labyrinth at the cathedrals in Auxerre and Sens in the 14th through the 16th century. And our own beloved labyrinth historian, Jeff Sayward, suggests it's not unreasonable to think they may have also taken place in the 13th century at Chartres. Wright also speaks of an Easter procession at Chartres that moved from the choir over the labyrinth, down to the baptistry in the crypt, and back up and over the labyrinth on the way to the choir. The 12th century baptistry's position in the crypt lines up with the western part of the labyrinth. So there may still be more to discover about how the baptistry, a symbol of life, death, and resurrection, relates to the 13th century labyrinth. The Easter liturgy of the labyrinth celebrating Christ's victory over death and the devil may have been related to the dramatic expelling of the Easter dragon. And yes, I did say Easter dragon from the cathedral. Geoffrion, former attaché to the Chartres Cathedral and local historian, reports that each year, 3 hours after the liturgy of the Easter dance on the labyrinth, and after the end of the final service of the day, which is called Compline, several people would put on a dragon costume and then be chased by parishioners out the doors of the cathedral. One wonders if it's a coincidence that this image of St. George, the dragon slayer, is placed just beyond the labyrinth in the North Clerestory. On a happier note, more recently in pre-COVID times, the Chartres Cathedral bishop and congregation celebrated its own Easter evening liturgy of light on and around the labyrinth, and we hope that it will be reinstalled again this year. Unfortunately, there's no documentation of how the laity used the labyrinth in the Middle Ages, but it seems utterly obvious that it would have been used devotionally by those who considered the nave their part of the church. In 1650, Reverend Souchet, one of the priests at the cathedral, speaks of those who use the labyrinth during various celebrations as, quote, wasting their time turning and running. I'm guessing that not everyone agreed. Now, let's turn our attention to some of the features of the Chartres labyrinth that contribute to its unique expression in the cathedral. The labyrinth at Chartres covers the floor from pillar to pillar in the nave. It's approximately 42 feet wide. It was the widest medieval French labyrinth that was ever installed. Its placement on the floor of the cathedral emphasizes vertically what we saw earlier when we considered its horizontal location between the third and fourth bays of the nave. It is a place where heaven and earth meet. Below it in the crypt, the well descends 120 feet. And above it, the church rises 120 feet to the ceiling vault. The circular nature of this particular labyrinth is echoed throughout the rest of the cathedral, as is obvious as one stands in the middle of it and looks around and up, as you can easily see with all the circular shapes in the rose window and also in the keystones above. John and Odette Kettley Laporte, authors of Chartres, The Labyrinth Unveiled, say this: the circle is a symbol of eternity, of infinity, and thus also of omnipresence, and of the all-encompassing power of God. It is also the traditional symbol for the sun, and for Christianity, the sun represented Christ, the rising sun. Chartres was not unique in being circular in shape, but the number of circular shapes within it, at least 159, is unparalleled elsewhere. It is as if the design is shouting in a very, very fluid way, holy, holy, holy. The Chartres Labyrinth is the oldest medieval cathedral labyrinth that still exists. One of the reasons for this is that it is made of materials from Berchères-les-Pierres, limestone from that quarry 6 miles from Chartres, and a black marble-like stone from Givet in the Meuse region, about 217 miles from Chartres. One of the characteristics of the limestone from Berchères-les-Pierres is that it hardens with age, for which we can be extremely grateful. To me, the threshold stone of the Chartres Labyrinth is the most beautiful stone of all. It's what I miss more than anything when I walk a Chartres replica. We don't have any record of what it might have been originally called, but it symbolizes so many things: a door, a gate, a chalice, a baptismal font, and surely many, many other things as well. It may seem obvious, but it is important to note that the first stone on the pathway is also the last stone on the pathway. The cyclical nature of reality and time was obvious and celebrated in the Middle Ages and in Chartres. It was also an important part of the labyrinth experience, which is echoed in the stained glass above it. Christ, like the threshold stone in the labyrinth, was the beginning and the end. He was the Alpha and the Omega. And here he is shown in the St. Lubin window to the north of the labyrinth, holding a book with Alpha on one page and the Omega on the other. On the other side of the church, in the clerestory, we find Christ with the Alpha and the Omega on either side of his halo. So everywhere we hear echoes of the beginning and the end. Having crossed the threshold, one begins to walk on the pathway towards the center. Written in the medieval manual for priests of Chartres was an instruction about liturgies and all processions, and they were expected to move according to the arc of the sun, or said in another way, clockwise. Like the pilgrims who came to Fulbert's crypt and walked through it as part of their pilgrimage, those who enter the labyrinth turn first to the north and enter the center from the south. The pattern of the Chartres Labyrinth includes 34 turns, 28 of which are 180 degrees, and 6 which are 90 degrees. There are many different ways that people have expressed the pattern of this path. Although it is circular on the floor, its nature can be understood in a rectangular way. But no matter how you draw it, the Chartres path has a symmetry from side to side and from the outside to the center. You could imagine, as the Catalina Laportes did, that the path's movement is a representation of Mary with its M, an inverted M shape. All agree it's a double mirror pattern. You rotate the first half of the cadence and obtain the second half of the cadence. Craig Wright calls the pathway a double retrograde and notes that the same double retrograde pattern was used in some medieval motets. These were polyphonic compositions based on sacred texts and usually sung without accompaniment. Some have used the musical score to show the rhythm of the path as it unfolds, while other musicians have shown the pattern through musical notations. which they call the song of the pathway. Those who prefer counting things have expressed the nature of the path through mapping and numbering of stones on the Chartres labyrinth, which according to a modern interpretation may correlate with the 9 months of human pregnancy. No matter how you depict or experience the Chartres pathway, one thing is certain: it leads to the center. The flower-shaped center has 6 petals, and they are divided in 2, thus creating another, how can I say that? Creating a flower with 12 partitions. The center of the center, as you see, is a large circle. The center, like the pathway, can be understood or expressed in many different ways, geometrically, or using number symbolism, or using visual symbolism, or in many other ways as well. Early Christian poets saw Mary's motherhood as enclosing heaven and earth within her womb, symbolized within the space of a single round rose. If we look to the west of the labyrinth, we can see Mary wearing and holding 6-petaled flowers. And so we can say in some ways, the flower in the center is a Marian reference. We want to notice too, the 3-petaled flowers in the center of the labyrinth. 3-petaled lilies were often shown in Annunciation scenes at Chartres, clearly another Marian reference. But the beauty of symbols is that they point to more than one reality. The rose was also an ancient symbol from the East and was used to portray the nature of God in Sumerian, Babylonian, Jewish, and even Roman art. Thus, if we turn again to the Jesse window to the west of the labyrinth, and this labyrinth, this window clearly precedes the labyrinth, we find Jesus surrounded at the apex with 6-petaled flowers. And just to clarify, there aren't very many 6-petaled flowers found anywhere in the cathedral. If we want to take things in a different direction, the 7 at the center of the labyrinth is echoed in the clerestory rows above the labyrinth with the 7 aspects of the Spirit of God. Historically, there was a plaque in the center of the labyrinth that was held in place by rivets that were driven into the floor. It was removed in 1792 or 1793 and repurposed by the revolutionaries. Based on references in French historical texts, and I know some of you aren't going to like this, but the texts are pretty clear, we can assume that it contained an image of Theseus and the Minotaur, perhaps similar to the one found at the 11th century church in Italy. Since it's hard for many of us with modern sensibilities to accept that there was a battle scene in the middle of the labyrinth, perhaps it is a blessing that the plaque is no longer in the center of the Chartres labyrinth. As I've said more than once, symbols open up meanings for us. So what we find in the center of the labyrinth naturally reflects what we bring to it. There's some talk by labyrinth enthusiasts in Chartres, French labyrinth enthusiasts, of reinstalling a central element, although this is far from being realized. And I would like to say, considering the possibilities brought forth so far, this too might be a blessing. Let me finish this section with 2 names from the later centuries that have been applied to the labyrinth: Jerusalem and heaven. Many people ask, what relationship might there be between the west rose and the labyrinth below it? Let me point out 2 myths about the rose in the labyrinth. You cannot fold down the rose and have it lay over the labyrinth. It would miss by about 10 feet or 3 meters. The 2 aren't the same size either. However, having said that, many, including me, report a palpable connection felt from the center of the labyrinth to the center of the rows. What about this circular ring around the outside of the Chartres labyrinth with its 112 extensions? The Chartres labyrinth would look very different without it. I'm guessing it would also feel very different without them. These extensions have been called many things by respected labyrinth authors: cogs, crenellations, cups, a halo of ornamentation, lunations, teeth, even a ring of fire around paradise. If we look back to the Roman mosaic labyrinths, we may find a needed clue to understanding them. On the outside of the perimeter of the Roman labyrinths, there were often extensions that mimic protective battlements. We see these in the windows of Chartres as well. Here, to the south of the labyrinth, as the pilgrim leaves the city of Jerusalem, we notice the crenellations on the top of the tower and also in the city walls. This image can be viewed from the entrance stone to the labyrinth. And if we turn to the west, in another image, in an image that predates the labyrinth, the inhabitants of Jerusalem here are welcoming Jesus on what came to be known as Palm Sunday, and we see the same form. But it's a symbol, so we could take it in another direction, that of religious architecture. We find the same shape on the wall of the west wall of Chartres in this presentation image. And these statues and these forms, this row of columns, it predates the labyrinth by at least 50 years. Quite strikingly, we can notice the same type of ring in the western rows, which was constructed around the same time as the labyrinth. This common shape was often used in monastery cloisters, a place for sacred reading and reflection that often contained a well and/or a healing garden. If I had more time, I would love to share how the labyrinth is surrounded by stained glass, whose colors, themes, images, and shapes all influence those who walk it or walk over it. There is so much more that could be said. But as we near the end of this presentation, I want to express one more time the deep gratitude I feel for the builders who carefully and cleverly created this labyrinth in this space. Their example inspires me, and I hope all of you, to always birth labyrinths in ways that fit beautifully and meaningfully into the contexts in which we install them. As I walk the labyrinth at Chartres next Friday one last time before it closes until March 4th next year, I will hold us all in my heart and thus bring you here to be with me once more. I hope one day to be able to welcome you in Chartres in person. And I'd love to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Jill. We've only got a few questions that came up. I know that they will send you the comments. I was monitoring the comments, and I was trying to multitask, and it was hard. I was trying to listen to the presentation and monitor the comments, and you were blowing me away. I studied medieval art and architecture in grad school a little bit, and we studied Chartres a little bit, and you brought back some memories about the medieval iconography and how everything goes together within a medieval building. Nothing is separate, they're all related. Just a couple of questions, and then we can take a few questions from the floor if we have time.
Sure, go ahead.
And somebody asked, is there a window to Mary Magdalene, and do they celebrate their feast day?
Oh, yes, to both. We have more than one window. We also have a number of statues here to Mary Magdalene. She has her own window, and it is on the south side of the labyrinth, just before you get to the labyrinth. And there are also images actually right above the labyrinth, even closer to the labyrinth, directly above it, as you are in what would be the fourth quadrant of the labyrinth, the sort of the southwestern quadrant. There's a whole image of her in that clerestory window, and behind you in the west, on the southern side as well, there are several very beautiful images of her post-resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I just add something? Because my question was, where can we see images of those online?
Okay, so there's a wonderful site. I Google Pittsburgh stained glass Chartres, and they have every single image of the whole cathedral on that site. And let me see if I could quickly, not sure if I can quickly find it for you.
I'll look it up. I'll look it up so
Yeah.
you can answer questions.
If you can't find it, just email me. I use it every day. Every single image is there.
Yeah. The other question that really jumped out at me is somebody asked for more resources. If you have some recommendations for resources for learning more about the School at Chartres and how they taught the 7 liberal arts.
Yes, there's a wonderful book by Peter Ellard. Look up his name. He's one of, and I would also go to the Wisdom Schools, Google Wisdom School Chartres, and then we'll have a bibliography there that I think would be very helpful.
Can you spell that author's name for me?
Ellard.
Thank
Peter
you.
is his first name for sure. Happy hunting.
And we just have, there's another question that just come in the chat. Can you say something about the controversy about the cleaning of the beloved statues, including the dark Madonna that is now white? Do you have any insight or information about that?
Yes, I do. I miss the old statue. That's my first comment. Before she was restored. Historically, in my book, Visions of Mary, I have a full explanation of what happened and why it happened. Basically, she was actually white before, and then in the 19th century, the clergy painted her black, and she was very beloved in that form. And then during this current restoration, the state did a restoration of her and didn't really, I guess the church didn't speak up loudly enough. And so she came back white. And I think for me, the hardest thing about the whole deal was when I went to the lecture of the opening showing this new white statue of Our Lady of the Pillar, she had eyebrows, and the woman who had restored her said, well, she didn't actually have eyebrows, but I thought that any one of her, any 16th or any woman from the 17th century would have wanted to have eyebrows. And that didn't sound like a restoration to me. So we there's a deep missing of the dark Virgin. However, the good news is that in the bishop's residence, there's a copy of the old and non-restored Lady of Our Pillar, who is sometimes still brought out.
Here's another question that's just come. While it's clear that the orientation of the rose window to the labyrinth isn't direct, folding doesn't fit, I'm wondering if there might be a relationship to a person standing at some point in the labyrinth.
that is a very good question. And actually, there's a new woman, there's a group of people who are called hospitality something or other on Friday at the Labyrinth. And there's a new woman who's there, and she's going to do some measurements with lasers. And I'm going to ask her to specifically measure that, because that would be very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah. We have just a couple of minutes left. I do want to make, Jill, there's just some wonderful, wonderful comments that will be sent to you, people who are some conversation. I just want to say you gave me just an absolutely new perspective on not only the historical context of the Chartres Labyrinth, but how that influences labyrinth thinking. Because we often think of the Chartres Labyrinth as the grandpa of all labyrinths moving forward, in terms of, and it's what launched the modern labyrinth movement, but understanding its context and some of the things behind it are just mind-boggling to us. I mean, to me,
Well,
I
presented about
monitoring the comments, it's like, yeah, I think other people felt the same way too.
Well, I had to cut literally 4/5 of my presentation. It's so complex, and I could really talk for at least 4 hours about the windows around the labyrinth. It's so exciting to see all the connections, and come and please, if you can, get here and experience it for yourself and tell us what you discover, because everyone sees something different, feels something different, discovers a new area to explore.
Well, the last comment I'm going to read, because we're right at time here. It says, encore, more, and I might suggest that at some point, if you have some resources you could share with those of us who have seen this presentation, where we might be able to do some more study on our own, that would be fabulous, because I would love to learn more.
Okay, that sounds great. And I did just I saw one thing. The Labyrinth is closed between All Saints Day, which is November 1st, and the beginning of Lent, whenever that happens. And this year we have one more Friday left, and then it will reopen on March 4th. So if you're coming to Chartres this winter, it won't be open. I just want to make sure everybody understands that.
Yeah.
Thank you for this opportunity to share what I obviously love so much.
Well, your passion is palpable. Thank you. It was a pleasure to actually meet you virtually, because I've read your books, and I just got a gift of your book after we dedicated a labyrinth at Rollins. A friend of mine gave me a copy. I guess it's a second copy, or maybe it's a copy of one of your books I don't have. So thank you so much, Jill. And it was a wonderful presentation, and we'll be sending you the comments, and we look forward to you presenting for us again.